Ruth chapter 2. Fall and the season change and the time change all bring a lot of memories to mind for me. I'm sure they do for everybody. It's kind of like the certain psalms prompt memories or feelings or some response. I kind of have a lot of memories, particularly around the harvest, growing up on the farm. And I think a picture is of the Ford farm. And that kind of what it looks like when the harvest was going on. You look out across the land and you see, because it's just flat, it's Illinois flat. And you see nothing for a long way except barren fields. And then you see these homesteads, and there's fewer and fewer of those homesteads as you go up there. There were times when we gathered with all the neighbors to pick seed corn, and we gathered together before dark, getting ready, making plans, fueling up tractors, and so there was just lots of company and fellowship, and it was just joyous to go out and do that together. And there was other times where it was kind of lonely and quiet and serene, and we were standing in the middle of a field, at the edge of a field rather, and the combine was on the other side, and there was just suddenly you were alone with the Lord, and it was very quiet and very serene. And you know, you look across the land and you see a few fall colors, but for the most part, everything was beginning to sort of fade out and be have a dead look about it, and looked kind of barren as the fruit of the land was harvested. It was quite a visual contrast when everything losing its color, and then the combine or the corn picker would come by and dump that load of bright yellow corn into the wagon, and it was the fruit of the land, and it was just interesting contrast, those memories of seeing that. So it was like farmer's payday in the harvest. It was sometimes a great blessing and just overwhelming, and other times it was a little more lean, and for the farmers in a bad year. But there was always this underlying sense of it will be what it will be. It will be what the Lord will have it be, because God is our provider. And that thankfulness that began, I think, in those fields, those often came to full measure on Thanksgiving Day, when pretty much everything was done in probably October. You were doing a little bit of plowing and into November, and sort of all began to quiet down around the farm by Thanksgiving. And so as we go back into Ruth, we sort of remember that it was harvest season when Ruth joined Naomi in her plight, and unable to care for themselves in Moab, they returned to Bethlehem and found bread in Bethlehem at the harvest season. And even then, Naomi came to town, and folks were saying, "Is that Naomi? She's been gone for 10 years." And she said, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara." And so her life was, as far as she was concerned, was defined by the bitterness of the previous 10 years. And so as we jump into Ruth chapter 2, we just take the first verse for a moment. There was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And so we are introduced to this new character to our story of Boaz, although he's not going to be sort of this primary character just yet. Obviously, as we look at Ruth, the providence of God, and God is front and center, and he is working behind the scenes. But up to this time, Naomi was sort of the primary focus of where God was working. And now we see a shift towards Ruth, but he sets the stage first with Boaz. Boaz was a relative or kinsman of Elimelech's family, and the thought is that he was probably about Elimelech's age probably very close to that, and is referred to as a Gibor in this passage, which has a wide range of meanings. Is this the idea of being a man of great wealth? That great word great is often translated to mighty. And it is the idea of being powerful or even manly, or a champion or a warrior, or mighty, strong, valiant, along those lines. And the word's used many times in the Old Testament, and we see it used to speak of David's mighty men, same word. It's also used in a negative context from Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. The Lord was mighty in battle. We see angels that were referred to as Gibor, and among others in the passage. And so Boaz was a wealthy Gibor. He was this man of great wealth, prominence, influence within the community. We should notice that while Elimelech had run off beginning of chapter 1, we saw Elimelech had ran off to Moab because there was a famine in the land. And Elimelech experienced great tragedy, and he passed away, and his kids passed away. And while that was going on, and then he left these 3 widows to try to figure out how to get by, we see Boaz is becoming a man of faith, a prominent man, and a wealthy man. And so you see a little bit of a contrast. Elimelech ran to Moab in the famine, but Boaz was right there in Bethlehem, and it's sort of a picture of this faithful man knowing that the Lord would provide. And so during Elimelech's 10-year-old decision, we see this revealing of the consequences become more evident, because the people of Bethlehem had not starved and wasted away. They had pressed on during that. We sort of see this Elimelech running from that. And of course, God's providence is at work even in that supposed unfaithfulness. Before we leave that idea, sort of setting up the idea again of who Boaz is, remember the story of Joshua from Joshua 2, when the spies were sent into Jericho. And the spies ended up in Rahab's place, and Rahab, the harlot of Jericho, hid these Israelite spies, preserving their lives at that time. And when Jericho fell, Rahab and her family were preserved by the Israelites. And she went on to dwell with Israel, and she married a Jewish man named Salmon, and they had a son named Boaz. And so Boaz's mother was Rahab of Jericho, the harlot of Jericho. And so Boaz had a mother that was a foreigner, Gentile, of not so great reputation in her early life, that had come into Israel, and probably as she became to live like an Israelite, she probably suffered through her old reputation, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as part of who Boaz is. And so when we see Ruth come along later and we see Boaz's response, it may very well be because of Boaz's mother that he understood what a woman was going through when she came from the outside. Let's go on. Made our way all the way to verse 2. So I want to show you 3 important things of this process, and then we'll draw from that at the end. The first is this bold step of faith, verse 2. So Ruth the Moabitess, the author wants us to know that she is a Moabitess. He's going to remind us several times here, don't forget she's a Moabitess. And she may be attached to Naomi. She's in Bethlehem. She's a Moabitess. And they want us to know this. It's very important. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. And so at the time there was this provision that was made because these two widows had no means of surviving. There was no social programs. There was no way to really for them to provide for themselves. Ruth is not going to sit back and wait for Naomi to put food on the table, but now Ruth steps forward, as I said, as sort of this prominent character in this section of the scripture. And Ruth took this initiative, asking if she could go glean. So somewhere along the line, she learned from Naomi that gleaning was part of the Israel's law. Israel law provided that you wouldn't cut around or harvest the edges, corners of the field. And in doing so, you left provision. I thought I had the verse in here. I don't see it off the top of my head. But they left some of the edges of the field for the poor to come in and were able to harvest some of that for their provision. And so there was a law for that, but we got to remember this was in a time when everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. This was the times of the judges, right? And so a lot of the laws didn't mean a whole lot in that time because everybody was sort of winging it, so to speak. There was another law that said, an Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord even to the 10th generation, and none of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the road when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor and Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. And so even built into the Israelites' understanding was these Moabites and Ammonites had not responded to them correctly, and they had become this enemy. And not just that they didn't give them bread and water, but they were determined to curse them and lead them astray. And of course, we know that the Moabite women had drug some of these men off to worship. They drug these men off to worship. And some of the worship was pretty immoral, and it cost Israel a lot as they were coming into the land. And so knowing that as the Israelite, and then this Moabitess shows up in town, I kind of imagine that maybe some of the women are looking at this Moabitess, ascribing to her all of this old past and its history because she's from Moab. And I wonder if that's not why we're being reminded this constantly, that there's baggage that goes with being from Moab and being a Moabitess. It might have been the women locking up their husbands. And because of the immorality that had been ascribed to the Moabite in the past. And we don't know that for sure, but I think it could be a consideration in this story. And so there's a law that says you should allow gleaning, but nobody knows for sure if that law was ever really widespreadly used, if it was part of the culture that everybody just did. We don't know how hard they pressed on this Moabite woman as she entered in town, and how hard they made her life. But gleaning was there as part of the law. Gleaning gave the person an opportunity to work for their food, which was an opportunity to preserve dignity, was taking a handout, but that you had the opportunity to go out and work for your food. And it follows in that line of you don't work, you don't eat. And so we see Ruth stepping forward to work so that she could provide for Naomi and for both of them that they might eat. In Matthew 15, there's the story of the Canaanite woman that sought the Lord's help to heal her daughter. And his disciples came and they urged him, saying, send her away, for she cries out after us. This Canaanite woman was somewhat annoying to them. Send her away, she's making too much noise. And he answered and said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then she came and she worshiped him, saying, Lord, help me. But he answered and said, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. And she said, yes, Lord, but yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall off the master's table. And Jesus answered her and said to her, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire." And so we see that sort of that attitude of this woman that sought after the Lord and sought just this, the Lord's provision in her life to bring this healing. And he called her diligence and her willingness to seek him out as a woman of great faith. And I think that's what you see with Ruth. You see this initiative that she takes. And she is presented of a woman of faith and of commitment. And when she made that commitment to follow after Naomi, I think it becomes visible now. Now we get to see the fruit of that commitment. Now we're all the way to verse 3, I think. Then she left and she went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. And now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered him, "The Lord bless you." So Ruth goes out to glean. She's just going out to the field. Now the way the fields work, there would be, imagine a large field, and she saw the picture of. But within that field, you have maybe a section for this family, and you have a stone at the corners. And you'd have another family and a few stones to mark that off. And so you could go from field to field to field to field, from family to family to family, and maybe never even know that you crossed over a line. And you didn't care if you were gleaning. You were just trying to pick up the gleanings. And while that field you looked at, I think it was a cornfield. You look at it close enough, but it had been plowed under a little bit. So you would have had this field of this all cut down, or being cut down by the workers, and they would cut the stalks and pile the pile of stalks, and then the women would come behind them and bind them together, and that they would take those sheaves then and pick those up in the harvest and take them to the threshing floor. And so when they missed stalks or didn't harvest the edges of the field, that the gleaners could come and they could cut those stalks on the edge of the field and have them for themselves. And so we see Ruth go to the field, and it just so happens, they use this term that the world would call, gosh, what a lucky thing for her to wander into the field of Boaz. And the world would say, what a coincidence. And of course we see the providence of God. We see God's plan coming about in this divine appointment, that she didn't just wander into fields and accidentally come across Boaz, but we see God bringing her before Boaz. Boaz is quite a guy now. He's a wealthy Gibor. If he is a wealthy man, he doesn't need to go out to the field. He could have been staying home counting his money. And so when we see this wealthy man, he's come out to the field. But he doesn't treat the workers like they're slaves or just a commodity that he uses to harvest his field. But he came to Bethlehem and he said to them, "The Lord be with you." And he blesses them with this statement. And so from this, and they respond to this, "And the Lord be with you." And this is a blessing he's given to them, and they bless him back. And you see this relationship of a godly man caring for those people. And so we can look at that and say, Boaz was not ruined by his wealth. Wealth had not removed Boaz from his fields. Wealth had not distanced him from his workers, and wealth had not distanced him from his God. And so he was not just wealthy financially, but he was wealthy in faith and wealthy in his grace and his kindness towards these people and the way he treated them. And we'll see more of that as we go. Then Boaz, verse 5, said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And so the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, it is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, please let us glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. And so he came so she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house. And so Boaz notices Ruth, as he said, this was a small town with a couple hundred people. This woman is in his field, and he said, who is she? Which is also sort of asking, whose is she? What father, tribe, clan, who does she belong to? And trying to identify her. The foreman of the field responds that, again, reminding us that she was a Moabite woman. And she came and though it was her legal right to glean, according to the law, we see that she did not take that for granted. That she had come and asked him if he could glean. Now, others see that she was asking for more than gleaning here, that there was a boldness about what she was asking. And I'm not sure that's true, and there's some obscurity in the language, particularly in the last half of verse 7, about she rested a little while in the house. There's some assumptions made, and basically nobody knows exactly how to interpret that passage if you read about it. But what we get from this is that Ruth came out in the morning, and she's been working hard all day, and the appearance is maybe she stopped just for rest from time to time, but she was just getting after it. She was a worker, and it caught his attention and impressed this foreman that she was quite a worker. Even though they were getting nothing from it, she was gleaning for her benefit of Naomi. Then Boaz said to Ruth, verse 8, you will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. And so Boaz, as I said, notice she's a hard worker and that she's committed, understands that she is the one that came with Naomi. And we find out that he's heard of her. And so our second thing is that Ruth acted with this boldness of faith. And our second thing is then that she receives this unexpected grace. This unexpected grace was not available to her until she stepped in faith, exercising her commitment and her devotion to Naomi and to provide. And so that faith and that stepping forward allowed her then to receive this really unexpected grace from Boaz. So Boaz does three things. He says, don't glean to another field. You don't need to go anywhere else. We're going to make sure that you have plenty provision if you just stay in my fields, follow my people, and we will take care of you. He'd commanded the young men not to touch her, which is probably an important thing for a Gentile widow in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of these fields, with a bunch of young men around harvesting. It probably could be dangerous for a woman. But Boaz said that he was going to protect her, and he commanded these men. You certainly get the sense that this Gibor, this mighty man who was wealthy, when he said don't touch her, those guys said, got it. There was no problem. Nobody was going to mess with her. And so then the third thing is that he blesses her by saying, hey, if you want water, they're going to draw water. You take part. And so all of the provisions of those harvesting become part of her provision for her, and it was quite a blessing. And so she receives this unexpected grace when, in fact, you know that as Ruth went out to that field not knowing anybody and not sure if she was going to receive any blessing or any food, but she asked for permission, that you know that from that hopelessness of being a widow in that culture, that and really being lonely and not knowing anyone, suddenly this blessing of Boaz was huge for her life. And so she responded in verse 10 by falling on her face. She fell on her face and bowed down to the ground and said to them, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" Again, we get that reminder. I'm a nobody. I'm a foreigner. And you've shown me this kindness that is so out of the ordinary, that she was just overwhelmed with this idea. Verse 11, and Boaz answered and said to her, "It has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father, your mother, and a land of birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work, and full reward be given to you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." And so Boaz explains that it's because of her faithfulness and her commitment to Naomi. This is sort of that, maybe a small picture of what we will come to understand as those that bless Israel will be blessed, and those that curse Israel will be cursed. That she had loved on and cared for Naomi and followed her in such a way as to leave behind, turning away from all of her past to come and live with Naomi as an Israelite, as a Jew. Very much like his mom. Very much like his mom had done, that she had come out of Jericho and made a life with the Jews, that Ruth has now done the same thing. And I think that's such an important aspect of who Boaz is, to show this kindness. And we should notice that Ruth and Naomi had come to town, and they were immediately noticed more Naomi because she'd been gone. And can you imagine, in a small town, who is this woman that came back? She's a Moabitess. But we begin to see that she has attached herself to Naomi and cared for her, and it has drawn people's attention. And it's that idea that you're always being watched is really what the point I'm trying to get to. You're always being watched, even when you're unaware of it. As somebody's watching your faithfulness and watching your response to the circumstances you find yourself in. And so Boaz says, "The Lord repay your work with full reward." Well, Boaz was the one that the Lord would work through to do that very thing, right? So then, verse 13, then she said, "Let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." And she recognized that how this grace that was shown her, how special it was. And it was very much unexpected. Verse 14, now Boaz said to her at mealtime, "Come here and eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed grain to her. And she ate and was satisfied and kept some back. And when she rose to up to glean, Boaz commanded his young man, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her, and let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her, and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. And so we see Boaz going a little bit further. But this is huge because, and this is really the third aspect of this, is the idea of an extended blessing. And so she is blessed as she receives this grace. She's overwhelmed by it. But this provision is going to be so abundant that she's going to be allowed to extend that blessing. And whatever she receives from Boaz, she is taking home to Naomi. And so Boaz says, come here at mealtime and eat some of the bread. So Boaz provides bread for her that she's allowed to dip. This is like a big deal, right? She was allowed to dip into the sauce. It was like, hey, have a little bread and go off over there, Moabitess. But sit at the table. And notice Boaz is sitting at the table with the workers. This wealthy Gibor is sitting at the table with the workers and this Gentiles. And sort of suddenly you get a picture of Jesus sitting and with the tax collectors and the sinners, and everybody's going, I can't believe that Jesus sits with those people. And this is a picture of a messianic banquet, sort of getting a glimpse of that messianic banquet of Boaz sitting and providing for her, providing for these workers, allowing them to dip into the sauce, and it wasn't the kind of sauce, but and she sat beside the reapers, and they passed her the food, the parched grain, and she ate, and she was satisfied. You got to wonder how long it had been since she ate and was satisfied. And we don't even think about that, man. But she had no provision. She had no way. It had probably been a long time since she ate such good food and was satisfied. And it says she kept some back. This is I sort of picture her wrapping some food up in a napkin. She's taking a little doggy bag to Naomi, right? She's like, I am full, and there's still some left. And she takes a little bit more for Naomi. She's going to bring some of that. She's going to extend that blessing that she received to Naomi. And so she rises up to go back to work, go back to gleaning. And again, we see another blessing because he says, let her not just cut and chase down a stalk or two here and there, but that they would even let her glean among the sheaves. And so they're cutting the sheaves and piling these sheaves up, these piles of grain. The ladies are tying them, and they would just maybe pull a handful and set it aside and tie the rest. And they're actually doing more work and even blessing her beyond just having the ability to glean. And let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her, that she, and said, just let that happen. Bless her. You ever just do that? Just like, you don't have to bless someone. You ever do that, like the drive-up window when you pay for somebody? It's just goofy little things like that. But you know what that does for somebody's day? You know what it does when your day? And you don't know how you've blessed somebody, and it doesn't matter. Sometimes that blessing can be a smile, a kindness, and we reserve that stuff so much. We hold that stuff so close because there's a vulnerability to it, to open yourself up. That somebody might rebuke you if you show kindness. Somebody might be snotty to you or snarky to you. So what? I mean, it's more a reflection of them than it is you. You have shown kindness, and I think it's kind of a little side point. I don't think we do that enough. We just bless somebody, not for what we can get, and not because of what they did or who they are, just to bless them out of kindness. Verse 17, so she gleaned in the field until evening and beat out what she had gleaned. And it was about an ephah of barley. And then she took it up and she went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. And so she brought it out and gave it to her, and what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. When she gleaned whatever she had picked up, tied up, and had her sheaf of grain, she had to go to a threshing floor, which is usually a hard place, a rock. She may have went to Boaz's threshing floor, but essentially it pulverized those stalks then, and the chaff would be blown away, and you would just pulverize it, and the grain would fall out of the heads. And you gather up to the grain, and you would winnow it, throw the grain in the air, and the chaff would blow away. It was the way they cleaned it. And so that was what it means when she beat that grain. It was to winnow it, to harvest it. And so she takes this ephah, which is, this is a measurement that has not exact. It changes over culture a little bit here and there. But we could look at that in our understanding and say she had about a 5-gallon bucket of grain, of barley grain. Well, that's a huge amount of grain. And for someone to eat that is like weeks and weeks of provision for them of food. And so to see a ephah of grain of this bar is roughly 30 pounds, would be several weeks' provision of grain, and what a huge blessing it would have been. Not only she comes in with a 30-pound bucket of barley and says, look, Naomi. And Naomi probably hadn't been satisfied, being satisfied either for quite some time. And she wasn't sure how this Moabitess woman was going to fare out there gleaning. She's probably worried about her out there by herself. She's like, let me tell you about my day. Let me tell you how, just by luck, I ended up in this field with this guy. And he just blessed me incredibly. And then she went, oh, I got leftovers too. And she pulled out her doggy bag, put it in the microwave and nuked it up. And, and just blessed her. And she ate and was able to be satisfied too. And so she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and she said, the man's name with whom I worked today was Boaz. Imagine Naomi's eyebrows maybe went up. I know Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. And Naomi said to her, this man is a relation to ours, one of our close relatives. It said Naomi's eyebrows may have went up, but she suddenly knew exactly what field she had been in. And we see this, blessed be this man, and he has not forsaken or forgotten the loving kindness of the Lord, which is this kindness is a word that translated loving kindness and other things, but it's again that word that we look at as a Old Testament kind of a version of grace in the Old Testament. It is love and grace and peace and kindness, and this is the description of who Boaz was and how he acted toward her, and that in doing so, he had not forsaken his kindness to the living, Naomi and Ruth, but also the dead in taking care of them, that Boaz was honoring Elimelech and these two sons. I can't think of her name. Malon and, sickly, and all I can think of was sickly, and their names meant. But the two sons that he was honoring, Elimelech and the two sons, in caring for these two women. And that's what she's saying. And because he hasn't forsaken a kindness that way, she is noting that this man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives. And the close relative is the word goel, which you've probably heard, and it means a kinsman redeemer. And goel functioned as, it was a sort of a legal term that related specifically to the Israelite family law. And Naomi knew Boaz was a relative of Elimelech, and that he might act as a goel. Remember, everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes in this culture. You kind of go back and remember what is going on in Israel in general, how big of a standout Boaz must be. And Naomi is thinking, this guy is a near relative. Will he act as a near relative? The laws found in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and talking about the law of the Levirate law, which is talking about marrying the widow of the deceased to perpetuate that deceased man's family. We see the redemption of land was part of that. In Leviticus, the redemption of individuals. And so the role of the goel was to help recover the tribe's losses, because the tribes came into the land and had their allotment, and if for some reason a piece of that land was lost, a piece of a family, it was their job to try to maintain what God had given them. Family, land, whatever it may be. And so this included human loss by hunting down the killer, so he acted maybe as an avenger. The judicial losses, assisting in lawsuits. There was economic losses, recovering someone from the poverty to pay a debt, to regain tribal land, and of course, as we said, the Levirate marriage law, to father a child of the widow and to maintain that line. And so this was suddenly Naomi says, he's not forgotten the kindness, the loving kindness of the Lord. And this man has honored the living and the dead. And she said, he's close relative. And if he will act as a goel for our family, that they could be restored in some way. Verse 21, Ruth the Moabitess said, he also said to me, you shall stay close by my young men until they have finished all the harvest. Harvest season was about 7 weeks long. That went from the barley harvest right into the wheat harvest, and it was like 7 weeks long. And so Boaz invited her to stay with him all the way through the harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, and that people do not meet you in any other field. So she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest and wheat harvest, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law. Beautiful picture. And so we started to get a few glimmers of some typologies, and they're quite fascinating, but we should remember this story has taken place in Bethlehem. They say that east of Bethlehem there's a field called the Field of Boaz, and next to it is a shepherd's field. And they said next to the Field of Boaz at the shepherd's field, by Jewish tradition, they said, of course, that field is where Ruth met Boaz. They said next to that is where the angels announced the birth of Jesus. And it's a beautiful tradition, linking those stories. And of course, they need to be linked because of the lineage that Ruth is part of the lineage of Christ. When we see Boaz sitting at the table with the servants and workers and a Moabite woman, we get this glimpse of Jesus. And not just his ministry, but this picture of this messianic banquet in which all would be welcome who would come to him and trust in him. And Ruth, this Gentile woman, came to know Boaz, this type of Christ, by this Jewish woman, by Naomi. That had she not come with Naomi, that this Gentile woman would never have known Boaz. And it's the same picture for us, that if it were not for the Jews and the line of the Jews that brought Christ to the world, that Christ went first to the Jews, and then the Jews were to bless the whole world by their Messiah. And that we know we have this opportunity because of a Jewish Messiah, right? And so we see then Ruth goes back to the woman, and she's been blessed now. We see Ruth is blessed, and she goes back to this Jewish woman and in turn blesses her. And so we see her, this woman who we said at the beginning had characterized her life by bitterness. Suddenly, there's hope. Suddenly, things are beginning to change. Suddenly, we see the providence of God at work in her life in an incredible way. And the knowledge of this Redeemer, this idea of a Redeemer, of course, we'll pick up on that as we continue on, but it begins to form this beautiful picture. So we saw Ruth taking a bold step of faith. Ruth, this Gentile woman that would become a bride soon, she takes this bold step of faith, opening the way for this unexpected grace, which in turn brings an extended blessing. The world would say, my goodness, she is just lucky. The world would say, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. But we don't believe in luck, and Israel didn't believe in luck either, for the most part. Luck is a word that the world uses to replace the idea of providence. Grace is the evidence of providence. And it's found, I think, at the sort of the intersection of humility and hard work and opportunity. Because we see providence of God, we see this grace extended to Ruth, but it began by her step of faith and commitment to Naomi. And so grace is evidenced by providence. It's found this in humility and hard work and opportunity. And that all started with a step of faith. One of the commentaries had this paragraph I'd like to read to you. If we would benefit through Christ, we must adhere closely to him, his fields and his servants. As the Lord dealt bountifully with us, let us not be found in any other field seeking happiness and satisfaction in the world. Let's bow our heads.